Good evening. Great to be with you all. I have enjoyed my day so far in Columbia, and for those of you who weren't with us during the day, we're really glad you're here. We've been kind of talking all day, so we're just going to keep it up, and I'll talk for 40 minutes or so. We'll have plenty of time for some questions and discussion. We're going to talk about the church tonight. This book, A New Kind of Christianity, that I wrote is built around 10 questions, and one of the questions is, what are we going to do about the church? Just about everybody knows that we're in trouble in some ways. And we know it in the United States, probably not as strongly as they know it in Europe. Probably in the United States, we know it in the Northwest and the Northeast more than we know it in the South. But just about all of us are sensing, yeah, there really are some problems here, and we're going to have to face those problems. We don't want to end up this is actually a very nice church. I spoke there, and I just couldn't resist taking the picture. We don't want to end up where the way to our church is the way to a dead end, or like this cartoon. Welcome to the faith. Here's your complimentary box, outside of which you should never think again. Now, a little confession about myself. I'm an avid outdoorsman. I love to fish. I have a daughter who is a vegetarian and animal rights person, and she says, "Dad, you are such a nice guy. I just don't know why you get pleasure out of the involuntary body piercing of small-scaled vertebrates." That was her line. So maybe someday I'll outgrow it, but I do enjoy fishing, and I like all kinds of fishing, but I for the last several years, been doing some fly fishing. And I found out that there is a group of theologians who fly fish. Who would have guessed that? And they meet every year for a week in Yellowstone National Park, and while they're there, they fish for half the day and talk theology for half the day. And I got invited to join them. I just felt like I'd really arrived. But I need to tell you, this is what they call the group. They call it ichthyology, which is just really bad, but it's true. And so every year in July they meet in Yellowstone. And I don't know how many of you have spent any time in Yellowstone, but it really is a magic place, isn't it? There's just no place quite like it. I live in Southwest Florida, and actually this is true of Southwest Florida too. Many landscapes, like Yellowstone, are shaped by fire. Fire is an essential part of the landscape. They need fire to keep the landscape healthy. And each time I've gone, I've only been twice, but each time I've gone for ichthyology, there have been parts of the river that we couldn't go to because there were fires there from a thunder strike or lightning strike and so on. And you start to realize that the fires at Yellowstone are actually, you can't use this term today in the United States too easily or too carelessly, but it's a kind of redistribution of wealth. If you think of it like this, wealth over hundreds of years is taken from the soil and from the air, and it's stored in tall trees. And the wealth of the mineral wealth of the environment. And so when fire comes, it burns those trees, and then their mineral wealth goes back into the soil. And so you experience a short-term destruction. I know that looks like snow, but that's just the ash from the fire. And then what is surprising is that just in a matter of weeks, the grasses are back. In a matter of days sometimes, you see the beginnings of the resurgence of life, but then within a short time, it's just exploding as never before with diversity and vitality of life. So what looks like destruction is really just another stage in the renewal and the long-term sustainability of the healthy environment. So just file that away for a minute and then think about something you've all seen on the news a good bit lately. Do you remember writing letters? I mean, before the age of tweets and emails. You all, I'm sure, have heard that our U.S. Postal Service is facing some real challenges, budgetary issues. And although we might say first class forever, this year there's really been some anxiety about the future of the U.S. Postal Service. Now, I need you to know I'm a big fan of the U.S. Postal Service. I think it's one of the most creative, hardworking, high-tech organizations in the world. But we're going back in time right now to 2001. And in Wired Magazine, there was an article about the U.S. Postal Service. And in 2001, the Postal Service was facing between $2 and $3 billion deficit for the year. They were asked about how they were doing, and the leaders of the Postal Service reminded everybody how hard they were working. 700 million pieces of mail between 136 U.S. locations every day. He said that really requires amazing accomplishment. Then they were asked, what about email? Does that propose a threat? This is 2001. Email is not a threat, they said. In fact, they said much of the content of many emails, from jokes to chain letters, would not have been sent via the U.S. mail. Many of these short communications would instead be conducted by telephone. Do you get the message? Email is not a threat to the Postal Service. Email is a threat to the telephone. He went on to say, first-class mail is enormously secure. Some things will never change. There will always be some type of mail delivery. Postal mail is universal. The internet is not. That was 2001. 2002, online bill paying begins. And when online bill paying happens, it's the tipping point, and suddenly people start shifting from first-class mail to online bill paying. And when that happens, the $2.5 billion loss starts rising. And every year since then, it's been rising. Then in 2008, with the economic crash, even third-class advertising mail started to have a decline. And the results have been catastrophic. In 2010, an article, they said, 2010, they said next year in 2011, that's when the crisis is going to hit. And the declines were up in the $6 to $7 billion range. They were predicted to be about $9 billion this year. And if you see there, the critical issue was the decline in first-class letters, a decline in first-class letters. First-class mail is enormously secure, it had been said in 2001. They put out the stamp that said first class forever. That's the one thing we don't have to worry about. And here by 2010, it was a big problem. And then just a couple of weeks ago, the congressman who's responsible for the Postal Service said the situation is dire. If we do nothing, if we don't react in a smart, appropriate way, the Postal Service could literally close later this year. Now, I think they're trying to do everything they can to find some hope and help for the Postal Service. But it's a tough situation. And there are many factors. Some of you may know there's a budgetary factor about pre-funding retirement accounts and all the rest. But there really is an issue of the decline of first-class mail. Now, we need to talk about the church. And an analogy to the Postal Service may be, there's problems with that analogy, but I think there could be some lessons for us, some precautions for us to consider between what the Postal Service has experienced and what the church is experiencing. And I'd like us to not rush to solutions too quickly. I'd like us to think deeply about the challenges and the problems. You might say it this way: are we in the envelope, paper, stamp, mailbox, and post office business? In other words, is what we do as the church primarily identified by physical things? This building, bulletins, organs, Sunday school curricula. Are those things what really define us? Or are we in the communication business? And so that we would consider, some things might go by mail, some might go by email, some might go by tweet, some might go in person. We start to think, no, these things that we've considered so central to the church are really just media. They're not the message. And it challenges us to start thinking about what we really are for, what really is our purpose when we think about the church. We also have to face a radical shift in authority that's going on, that's part of the shift, that's part of the email shift. You might think about it like this. Before books, there were very few authority figures, and they were highly centralized. Kings, popes, dukes, that sort of thing. There were economic, political, and religious authority figures, highly centralized. But when the printing press happens, when books happen, we start disseminating authority. People start coming to universities where a lot of books are gathered together. You can learn what's in the books. And then some people would even be able to write books. But still, it's a relatively limited number of people who get through the hazing process of publishing to actually come out with a book. But then we get to the internet. And, I promise you this, any one of you in the room, it doesn't matter how old you are or whatever, we could get you online tonight, and within 10 minutes, you could have a blog. And with that blog up, you would have an international publishing ministry. You would have the possibility to be read in 15 minutes from now by anybody in the world who's on the internet. And suddenly you have authority. It might take more than 10 minutes, but we could set up a website for you. And do you realize the Vatican has a website? So in a certain sense, the little Baptist church out in the mountains, if they have an internet presence, there's almost a level playing field. They each have an internet address. And they're each equally accessible. And in fact, the smaller church, the website might be easier to get around because it has to accomplish less. My point is that something is happening through this shift that I think can help us in the church think about what we're about. And all of us who are Protestant. Now, the same thing has happened among Catholics in different ways, but among Protestants, I don't know if you've thought of it this way, but first with Luther, then with Wesley, then with Pentecostalism, if you want to think of the Protestant movement as having sort of three main waves so far, it's been all about disseminating authority. First, from one central church centered in Rome to national churches. So there would be a German Lutheran church, and there'd be a French Huguenot church, and there'd be et cetera, et cetera. So now we centralize authority to each nation. And then, of course, it gets multiplied through denominations even more. Wesley comes along, and Wesley starts finding ways to license and deploy preachers faster than anybody else had. And of course, Baptists are part of that too. A faster dissemination of authority to more and more people. And then when you get to the Pentecostals, my goodness, it's just rapid deployment and low levels of control, high levels of empowerment to get as many people with as much authority as they can handle, and maybe more than they really deserve, get them out there doing what they need to do. And even the very Protestant doctrine that I know Baptists hold very dear, this idea of the priesthood of all believers. For many of us, that meant priesthood for the church. Priesthood of all believers meant that everybody had a say in church affairs. But now we've got to start thinking even in different ways about that. That you're not just, your priesthood of all believers doesn't just mean that you have a right to do more things in the church. What if it starts to mean, no, you're a priest to your neighbors and your colleagues and the people around you, that we start to understand every single Christian who's being discipled is, well, here's how Paul said it, you're a letter, a living epistle, a letter sent from Christ into the world. We start thinking this is about multiplying authority and getting messages out through all kinds of means. And we start maybe measuring the impact of our church, not just how many people come to the post office building, but how many people we send out delivering mail, or how many people we start sending out with a message that comes through all the different dimensions of their life. If that starts to happen, this dissemination of power and this broadening of our understanding of what the church is, I don't think really what we're talking about is demoting the clergy to the level of the laity. I think what we're talking about is trying to lift the laity to where they understand themselves as all having a vital role. But here's the irony for the clergy. If the clergy are willing to lift the laity to where they are, in a sense, to lift them, the clergy are going to have to step up. It's really a promotion for the clergy because you can't bring somebody someplace you haven't been. And so there's a sense now that then the church almost becomes like the seminary was before, because we have to imagine the church deploying people to be servants and agents of God in all of our different professions. And you might think, well, what's the big deal there? Well, remember last year we were just getting over the big Deepwater Horizon oil spill down in the Gulf. And I don't know if you ever thought of this, but it struck me a lot that when for that collapse to happen out in the Gulf, there were an awful lot of Christians who signed off as engineers on an awful lot of documents that they shouldn't have signed off on. And I'm going to guess a lot of them were Baptists and Pentecostal and Methodist. And so they went to church Sunday after Sunday, heard sermons about God and faith and all the rest, but it never really clicked for them that one of the places they exercised their Christian faith was as an engineer. See? And as an engineer, they were representatives of the church, representatives of Jesus Christ, and to sign off on something that they knew shouldn't be signed off on, that was a spiritual failure. So that Deepwater Horizon wasn't just an engineering failure. It represented multi-levels of failure, and many of them, I think, come back to us in the church. So then what happens if we start to think of the clergy as being the people who are responsible for motivating people who go become servants of God in many different places where they work? I used to feel this. I was a pastor for 24 years, and people think I'm joking when I say this, but my favorite part of the service was the benediction. And it wasn't because I was just glad to have it all over with. I liked having everybody together. But at our church, we had a benediction, and whoever was preaching or leading that day would raise their hands, and they would send people to go forth to love and serve the Lord, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. And whenever I did that, I had this feeling, he's going out to be a school teacher, and she's going out to work in the government, and he's going out to serve God in the medical world, and she's going out to try to be an agent of Jesus Christ in the car industry, which she kept telling me was not that easy. And people would start to understand, I'm going out to serve God. I remember one guy, our church is right near the NASA offices, and I was preaching about this one Sunday. I was talking about how we're all servants of God, and that we're serving God in our work Monday through Friday. And our coming together on Sunday is not to do the religious stuff here, it's to be better equipped to go do the stuff that really counts out there. And one guy, a couple years later, he told me, remember that sermon you preached? He said, that was my first Sunday, not only in this church, it was my first Sunday in any church. The only reason we came is because my wife and I were having a lot of marriage problems, and she said, we need some help, so we decided to go to a church, and we had some friends who went to your church. He said, I came that Sunday. He said, that really struck me because I have a aerospace company. I have 100 employees, and I wake up every day feeling responsible to provide them work and a good salary and good working conditions. And he said, for a long time I felt like what I was doing really mattered. But when I came that Sunday, you told me that I was serving God if I did a good job of serving my employees. And something inside me told me that was true. He said, that's how I became a Christian. I thought, I know how it's supposed to be. That's what I'm called to. So the church starts to take on a very different role if we're willing to start thinking about it in some fresh and different ways. We start understanding that we aren't actually here to make Baptists or Presbyterians or Lutherans or whatever. We're actually called to be making disciples. And disciples are people who are called in to learn so they can become apostles, meaning sent out to serve and teach. And so the being called in is always to be sent back out. So what an amazing thing. We're having a lot of arguments about who can be ordained, can women be ordained, can gay folks be ordained, all these arguments where the irony is if you're baptized, if you're a disciple, you're ordained to service that really matters wherever you are. And talk about an adventure and missing the point. We're arguing about who can do stuff in the church building, It's like arguing about who gets to stand at the front window in the Postal Service when maybe that's really, we're just missing the real point. And this becomes especially important because, like the Postal Service, there are financial realities that the church has to face. A lot of us grew up in an era where 60 to 80 adults could keep a church going. Maybe 20 could keep the pastor and his family going. Maybe 20 could keep the building going, and another 20 could take care of missions and other kinds of things we needed to do. It's very hard today. All of you who are in small churches, wouldn't you agree? It's very hard to keep a church going with fewer than 200 members, and probably the numbers are going up unless you have your building paid off and you've got some money in the bank. It's just the economic climate is changing. And so not only for local churches, but for denominations. And I have the privilege of speaking to a lot of denominational leaders, and I'll just tell you, if you knew how many denominations are in trouble where they can look on their spreadsheet and they know when it goes into the red, there really are questions about sustainability. And those problems are problems, but they're also opportunities. Because have you ever noticed you get really creative when your budget doesn't work anymore? And when you got a lot of money, you don't have to be creative. But when the money starts to be tight, you start to ask some questions. Now, my guess is that every single pond and river and stream in South Carolina has some snapping turtles, but most of them don't look like this. This guy was found in New Jersey crossing a road. The people who found it said, "That's strange," and somebody grabbed it off the road and they threw it in the trunk of their car. And they knew something about snapping turtles. If you find a snapping turtle far from water, something's unusual. Unless it's about the last week of May, first week or two of June, then a snapping turtle will go far from water to lay eggs. And they looked at this animal and they thought, could this possibly be a mother going to lay eggs because she was crossing a road far away from water? They took her to a vet, took an x-ray, and that whole back part of her was just chock full of eggs, each about the size of a ping pong ball. And so somebody took her and let her go in their backyard, and that night she dug out a hole with her back feet and laid a couple dozen eggs. So here, this grossly deformed animal, you can guess what happened. When she was a little baby, about the size of a ping pong ball, somebody must have had a Gatorade, one of those Gatorade bottles, and the little plastic ring, they must have just thrown into the water, and she was swimming along, and it fit like a belt. But now she's grown and is so grossly deformed. But in spite of this gross deformity, she was alive, she was healthy, she was fertile. In fact, somebody said to me, she was the Barbie of all turtles at that lake. But just like that Barbie image isn't very healthy for human females, this is not very healthy for this animal. And she maybe weighs 8 pounds here, but full grown, she might weigh twice that. Imagine being twice that big with that same little plastic ring that won't grow anymore. So the people who found her, they wanted to help her, and so they very carefully, because they bite, they took a pair of plastic snips and they snipped that ring. Now I want you to think about what happened when the ring fell off. Suddenly the turtle went, no it didn't. When they snipped the ring, nothing happened because it's solid bone. Nothing happened at all, except that when the plastic ring was gone, now there was a new possibility. And the possibility is that over the next 10, 15 years, the turtle will grow to be shaped like a guitar. And a turtle can survive as a guitar. It can't survive as a number 8. So she had a future. Even though nothing changed, when you changed one idea, when you changed one plastic ring, something could change. And what about in us? If there's some idea or assumption that we have, the church has to be like this. The church has to do this. It's not a church if it doesn't do that. It's not a church if it doesn't look like that. There might be a bunch of plastic rings in us, and it's time for those rings to be snipped. And guess what? If you decide, no, we don't want to snip them, it's too much trouble, we don't want to confront that idea, well, it's okay, you won't survive. Maybe it'll take 20 years, maybe it'll take 60 years. You might not make it. That's okay. It's not the end of the world because somebody else will. And new possibilities will emerge there. While the U.S. Postal Service was assuming that that internet is not a threat, well, the internet continued to develop, so communication carries on. And in the long run, forms come and go, but what really matters is the function. In the case of the Postal Service, the function is human beings communicating and connected to each other. But what's that function for the church? What is that thing that really matters for the church? By the way, once I started showing those pictures, people started sending me pictures, so I have a horrible catalog now of deformed turtle pictures. That sort of thing has happened quite a bit. So, brothers and sisters, I'd like to suggest that the struggles we see going on in the church, in some cases numerical decline, in some cases aging of congregations and the loss of younger generations, in many churches an ongoing failure to cross barriers of race, economic status, education, cultural background, the declining appeal of our churches to our own children and grandchildren. Right now, we see it's a problem, and there aren't many of us like the Postal Service in 2001 saying, oh no, there's nothing to worry about, everything's going to be fine. Not many people saying that now. Most of us in the church are saying, yeah, it's time to rethink some things. It's time to snip some rings, to ask what things, like Marion said, are biblical, what things are essential, and what things are simply cultural or traditional or conventional. And when we raise those questions, I think we realize then that some of the problems are not as destructive as we thought. They actually could be setting the stage for a new era of fertility and growth and health and vitality. Like those fires in Yellowstone, this could be actually a needed part of Jesus called it a pruning process, and we might call it a process of death and rebirth and renewal that the church needs to go through, and we may actually be at a point where the things that look to us to be so essential could actually help fertilize a lot of things that really need to happen. So in closing, I'd just like to mention about 6 things that I think we can do in our churches that we could help promote some of this needed change. I'm not going to tell you every church ought to look like this or that. I think we're moving into a time when that sort of standardization, where we think churches should be like McDonald's, same menu, same decor. I mean, McDonald's isn't even like McDonald's anymore. So, we know that there's going to be many different solutions. There won't just be one kind of solution anymore. But the first would be that we've got to create, calling them marginal zones. I mean, spaces over on the edge where people can be creative and can try some experimentation. Baptists are going to do this differently than Lutherans, and they're going to do it differently than Episcopalians, and they're going to do it differently than Catholics. But different groups will have to find ways, using their own polity and their own structure, to create the churches of tomorrow while the churches of today continue going, a lot of them business as usual. And this is happening around the world in some amazing ways. I used to live just outside of Washington, D.C., and when I go back to D.C., something I almost always try to do if I'm going to be in town for a couple of days, is I've got a good friend back there, and he and his wife are starting a new church. And they're starting a new church in downtown D.C. to reach out to the young adults who come to work in the government. And what happens is it's almost like slave labor, but young people come and they work 14, 16-hour days for congressmen and lobbyists and so on, because they're trying to get into the political world. They work really, really hard. And a lot of them have no religious background, or maybe they have a little bit, but when they get to D.C., there's just no time for anything except work, except late at night, on a weeknight. And I imagine they're free on Sundays, but they would never think of going to a traditional church. So my friend started a thing some people call it a theology pub, but they just call it a different bar around town in D.C. And I know to Baptists this must sound horrible, but to some Baptists anyway. Others, we know all the jokes about don't ask the pastor to go fishing with you. But anyway, they'll pick a bar in some part of downtown where young adults like to hang out. They'll advertise. They obviously get permission, and they'll get people together and have somebody come and talk about theology. And you've got an amazing array of people. Last time I was there, it was probably 125 people who just show up, and these are folks who are looking for a safe place to ask their questions about God and faith and religion and the Bible and so on. And those people, they all get connected by, email and Twitter and Facebook and so on. They get connected. And then my friend is starting other little groups to go deeper. And people don't realize it, but he's building a congregation. And he's making disciples. And it's a fascinating process to watch that happen. It's happening in so many different ways. And one of the things we're going to really need as we work this through is some different kind of economic model. And that's the point he's at now. Right now, his wife is paying the bills. She's got a really good job. And in some ways, she's supporting him to do ministry of the kind that he's doing. But gradually, they want to figure out a way to start inviting people to be financially committed so that it's an economically sustainable model. But you know what? They never think we've got to own a building. They never think we can't wait to have a big worship band and all that. That's not the economic model they're thinking about. And in fact, where life really gets interesting is there are some larger churches in the city that would be glad to have them show up on Sunday if people want to, if they carry on the real ministry that they're doing between Sundays. I was asked to speak at a big cathedral in San Francisco. Many of you have probably heard about the beautiful big cathedral there. It is maybe the wealthiest church I've ever been to. I mean, you go to, they have a parking garage, and in the parking garage, it's all Lexuses and Jaguars, and it's like a yacht club of cars. And when you come in, you see mink stoles and diamonds and all kinds of, it's a very, very affluent church. But they advertised that I was speaking, and it turns out that a lot of the people who read my books in San Francisco are the pierced and tattooed crowd. So it was the funniest thing. Of course, I'm dressed up in robes because it's very, high church, and they've got a boys' choir and organs and the whole thing. It was beautiful. But I looked out in one of those really high pulpits, and I'm standing up at the pulpit, feeling like I'm on this set of Titanic, and looking out over the people. And you see, the people who came because they wanted to hear me speak, and the people who are part of the church, they just stuck out like a sore thumb. And at the end of the service, the former dean of the cathedral invited everybody. He said, we have a coffee hour, and you're all invited. We have some coffee and refreshments. We hope everybody will come, especially our many guests who are here today. And so you go into this beautifully appointed parlor, and in there are folks dressed to the nines, and there are folks in ratty jeans and T-shirts, and they'd set off the detector in the security line. They'd never get through if they tried to get on a plane. And the dean came up to me, Alan Jones, and he said, "Isn't this beautiful?" He said, "This is what I've dreamed of." He says, because our congregation is normally so homogenous, everybody's the same, but this is more the way it should be. So many different kinds of people. And then he said to me, "If you can get a word out to your people," he said. But he said, "Tell them they're always welcome here. We won't ask anything from them because we know they're doing good in their different communities. And if they just need to be connected to the tradition, we're happy to do that." Do you understand? It's not either or. There's making space for both and, you see. And that's the kind of creative thinking we need as we go forward. Now, the second thing I always encourage churches that are thinking about change to do is we've got to sequester funds from what we're already doing over to what needs to be done, creative new things, knowing that many of those new things will fail. Fail in the sense that they won't become ongoing and successful in that way. But you know what? If we learn something from them, if it's a nice try, if it's an experiment, if it's research and development, that's not failure. And so where are these funds going to come from? Well, some of them are going to come from churches that have had a long and illustrious history and now have reached the point where their congregations may be a little too old to carry on, or they've had one too many splits and nobody has the energy to carry on. They're in a changing demographic area, and they just realize, you know what, there's a vibrant Latino church that needs a place to meet, and we have a few people left. We ought to just let them meet in our church. They're really reaching the people in this community. However it would happen, that there would be churches that would decide to, instead of using all their resources until they go out of existence, that they would sequester or save or protect some of their resources to go into a fund to help new things, experimental and innovative and creative forms of church to happen. And then I think what we're going to have to do is, and this is really important, and it's something that Baptists really agree with in theory, is that we're going to have to get serious about the E word, meaning evangelism. But evangelism, not just trying to attract people from other churches to our church, but thinking about the largest growing religious group in the United States. And it's not, the fastest growing group is not the Baptists, it's not the Pentecostals, it's not the Catholics, it's not the Mormons. The fastest growing religious group are the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, the people who define themselves as spiritual but not religious. And if we're going to have churches that connect with those folks, what's going to have to happen is those of us who are comfortable doing things a certain way, we have to give permission for folks to go do things that we would never want to be part of. Let's face it, if folks wanted to be in the church that you like, they'd be there. You're not keeping them away. But what would it mean to help there be churches that connect with folks right where they are? And so we start to make some space. Now, one of the ways I think we can do that is to think of the church less as a tree and think of the church more as a garden. What I mean by this is, very often when people think, let's reach out to some new people, they think, let's create a new Sunday service. And we'll have a contemporary service, or we'll have a postmodern service, which I just always think is a big mistake. But anyway, we'll have some other service. The thing they don't realize, though, is that just adding another service is kind of like adding a new branch on a tree. And did you all know this? A new branch never grows on a tree off the trunk, and it never grows unless there's a lightning strike that knocks off an old branch or something. I mean, new twigs grow on trees out at the edges, but a mature tree doesn't just grow a new branch off the trunk. You can start a new service that's just another thing of what you're doing, but to do something really different, think in terms of a garden. Think of it this way. Think, at our church, Second Baptist, we've been like a strawberry patch, like a quarter acre of strawberries for 100 years. We don't want to just plant more strawberries. We're going to start growing some green beans and some watermelon. And to do that, we're going to plow up some new territory. And we're going to let things be different. You want different growing conditions for those other crops. So you stop thinking of yourself as strawberry farmers and you start thinking of yourself as vegetable farmers, if you want to think of it that way. You start thinking, we're going to support and encourage a whole range of things, not just one kind of thing. And whether you're a local church leader or you're a denominational leader, you start understanding there are a lot of ways for the work of God to continue through us. I think that can really set us free. It can snip one of those little rings. And then I think we also have to give ourselves permission to allow these new leaders and new things that are going to develop. We've got to give them permission to think of what they're doing as a fresh chance to start being Christians. I'm using the word refounding. A fresh chance, a new start at living out the faith. Rather than telling them, look, we got to keep this Baptist thing going. It's been going a couple hundred years. We can't let it die out on our watch. Say, look, you got to keep the Baptist thing going. Look, there are ways Lutherans do things. You got to keep it going. It's really important. Can you imagine how much trouble will be if it all collapses on our watch? That's kind of a drudgery, and it's not an exciting vision to call people into. But say to people, listen, we need people who are going to discover ways of living the Christian life, being disciples, forming new disciples, doing Christian mission in the world. we've got to find creative new ways of doing it. And we want you to be Protestant in the sense that you can try something new and different. But we want you to be Catholic in the sense that you'll embrace everybody and not mean we've got the right way, but to say, no, there's lots and lots of ways to do this, and we're comfortable with that. And then 6, I think we've got to think different ways about our denominational identity. We're coming out of a strange period. For us, what is normal is strange in the history of the church. Having labels like Baptist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, and so on, that's not the way Christians have always been. That's this strange new thing of the last few hundred years, 500 years. Maybe now it's time for us to say, those labels, they're important. They tell us something about our history. But there aren't many people walking down the street in Columbia thinking, you know, I woke up today thinking, I just wish I could be an Episcopalian. You know, it's not happening to too many folks. So we start to think our call is to help make vibrant followers, disciples of Jesus Christ. And what that might allow us to do is to keep the Baptist tradition going, but to understand it in a different way. And we've got a great advantages for each of our denominations if we look back to our founders. Now, this isn't true for every single denomination, but it's true for most of them. That if we go back to our founders, what we will find are creative, adventurous, risk-taking people who are willing to step out of the box that they'd inherited. Obviously, the story of how Martin Luther did that is well known. A lot of people, they never think of John Calvin as an edgy guy who stepped out of boxes. But guess what? Calvin was a courageous and creative guy. You know, Calvin wrote a book on worship once that was banned by the King of France. So you know what he did? He had his book on worship bound in the cover of an Italian romance novel so it could be distributed in France and nobody would get in trouble. That was pretty clever, you know? So creative people who wouldn't take no for an answer. I don't know if we have any Nazarene folks here, but it's one of my favorite names for a denomination. Who would choose the name Nazarene? Well, I'll tell you who. The founder, his name was Phineas Bresee, probably the coolest name of a founder of any denomination too. And Phineas Bresee remembered that name, Nazarene, in Jesus' day was a name of reproach. You aren't a Nazarene, are you? It was seen as like being from the wrong side of the tracks. And so he said, we're going to start a denomination, a new movement. And we're so tired of everybody claiming to be the one true church who has it all together, purer and better and more doctrinally correct than everybody else. We're just going to take the name of the despised Nazarene. We just want to get out of that. You know who else did that? Didn't start a new denomination, but he started a new movement, St. Francis. Because he called his group the minor friars, the little brothers. We're not the great ones, we're the little ones, see. What will it mean for us to think about what it means to belong to our heritage in the generations ahead? And that gets more interesting these days because what's happening is you can divide churches up in a lot of different matrices, but in this one, if you were to think of liturgical, social action, evangelical, charismatic, you can maybe say which of those backgrounds you were born in. If you were born in a group that loved the Bible and was primarily focused on the Bible, probably you were evangelical. If you're in a group that loved aerobic worship, you were probably charismatic. If you grew up in a group that was big on helping the poor, social action. If you grew up in a group that cared most about proper and beautiful and artistic and worshipful liturgy, you were in that upper left quadrant. And we've all got our heritage where we come from. But what happens when you're an evangelical, like I was brought up evangelical, loved the Bible, and there are all those verses in the Bible that talked about poverty. And I kept noticing them. And we never read them in church, but they were always like a little before or after what the sermon was about. And so when the sermon would get boring, I'd read before or after. And there was always stuff about poverty. And I thought, if I want to learn about poverty, my evangelical friends don't have much to tell me. So I had to sneak to the back fence and find some social action folks and they understood about dealing with poverty. And I started learning a lot from them. What happens if you grow up charismatic? And if you grow up charismatic and year after year you're doing this, can I tell you something? After a while you think, I'm getting a little old, I still love God, but, and you start realizing that after 20 or 30 years, this isn't that different than this. It's just what our group does when we go to church. And so they think, we Pentecostals, charismatics, we're really good at experiencing God one step beyond the normal. They start to say, is it possible to experience God right in the center of the normal? And so they have to go talk to the liturgical folks who maybe have preserved some of the contemplative tradition and know something about finding God in quietness as well as in loudness, and in peace as well as in excitement. And so they start wanting to learn something. Meanwhile, some of the social action folks are thinking, man, I'm trying to fight injustice, but I'm running out of strength and I'm getting cynical, and I could use a good dose of Pentecostal joy right now. So all these people start coming to the back fence and sharing recipes and sharing with each other and wanting to learn from each other. They don't want to leave their old tradition and join the other one, but they want to gain the treasures from the other traditions. Now, when that happens, you can guarantee that some folks will think, oh, no, you don't. I don't like those Pentecostals, and I don't like those social action people, and those liturgical people, I don't like them either. So they'll barricade themselves out in that outer corner. And you know what? Don't worry. That's what they want to do. Let them do it. But the rest of us, we start to need to share some treasures, and that is going to, I think, enrich and nourish each of our traditions as we move forward. And what has looked like chaos and trouble actually can be a step in the right direction, a step toward renewal and new possibilities. So we're going to open up for questions in just a minute, and we've got a couple of mics here, and what we'd like to ask you to do, if you wouldn't mind, if you would come up to the mic, and we can do it sort of like baseball season. We'll have an on-deck box, and we can have as many people on deck as we need. I'd like to try to follow the boy-girl rule, so we don't have just all men coming up or all women. We'll try to alternate back and forth. And the first person to come up has to have a whole lot of courage, and then the second, it'll be a little easier. So we need, if somebody's got a question or a comment, you can make your way to the mic, and then don't wait for them to be finished. The next person come up, and we'll just sort of keep it moving. I'll give you a minute or two to think if you've got some questions you'd like to ask, and then we'll go into some discussion. And we can't play Just As I Am to invite people to come up, so. He doesn't really have a question. He just wants to do us a favor to get things rolling, so which is very nice. And come on up, Scott. Yeah.
No, Brian, how do you see the internet radically changing things? I mean, our church website, we're having hits from China, Russia every month. How do you see that changing from people coming in to getting the message out, and how could we be more savvy about using that?
This is a huge question, and if you're interested in this, I have some friends who teach like a 2-day little retreat on this. You could get them to come here to Columbia if you wanted. It's called Social Phonics, but they're trying to help Christian leaders learn about digital media. Let me maybe answer that on 3 levels. The first level is virtually nobody will ever visit your church for the rest of history without studying your website thoroughly. So everything in your website that is a barrier to people is sort of the opposite of advertising. What do you want to call it? It's anti-advertising. And so this really forces you to have to ask, what do we look like to the... Who are we turning away by what we have on this site? And this is really a problem for a lot of Protestants because we Protestants have been in a competitive market where we've been trying to get other Protestants and Catholics into our church. And the way we did it is by having a more correct doctrinal statement than the next guy. And you can just about guarantee that people who are part of that none group, spiritual but not religious group, when they see those things, the fact that you have that long list that you say people have to believe to be part of your church, that tells them we're not wanted here. You say, well, we have to have that. Well, maybe that's your version of you need a stamp and you need an envelope. I mentioned this friend of mine who's starting this new church down in D.C. You know what he calls this church? He calls it multi-creedal. And what he says is we have people here who come from many different backgrounds. And they bring their creeds of many different religions, and we make room for everybody. And if you have no religious background, that's fine too. So it's fascinating. If you were to look at his website, there is no creed at all, no doctrinal statement at all. Does he believe something? Of course he does. But he knows that if he wants to welcome other people in, and he defines himself by saying, here's the things we believe, you can't be part of us unless you do, that's just not going to work. That's going to be a huge issue for a lot of people they're going to have to face, but it's just there. So that's the first thing I'd say. People will not visit your church unless they have thoroughly studied your website, and it forces us to not only say what's on our website, but what's in us, you know, what's really true of us. Second thing I would say is that spiritual formation in the years to come, I think, is going to have a digital component for almost everybody. Meaning, what we used to do through things called quiet times and daily Bible readings and devotional guides and all the rest, we're still going to do, but they're going to come to us in a text message or in an email, and they're going to come to us. You know, in a way, I think we're going to experience the recovery of the church bell. And you remember the purpose of the church bell was to remind people, usually 5, sometimes 7 times a day, when it was time to pray. And it was just that bell would ring, and you'd stop when you were working out in the field, and you'd know it's time to pray. And I think that's going to be that dimension.
Weekings has a great daily, 4 times a day, a prayer reminder, just a short on Twitter.
Yep. So he said Weavings has a daily, 4 times a day prayer reminder on Twitter. It's in one sense we say this is new, but in another sense it's a recovery, like I was talking about a minute ago, a recovery of something old in our tradition. So we're going to have to learn how to, that those things are going to be increasingly important, especially for new people who are coming to faith. That's the second thing. And then the third thing I'd say is there is a balance, when we get together in person, there's a balance between regularity and intensity. What is intense tends to not be regular, and what is regular tends to not be intense. So let me say it like this. All the people involved in youth ministry here, you'll know what I'm talking about. If I say, you could have 52 weekly youth meetings a year, and that will have a certain effect. And you can have 2 retreats in a year, and you'll get more done through those 2 retreats than you do through 26 of those weekly meetings. There's something about the irregular and intense that has a very powerful effect on people. Now, we were joking over dinner that for a lot of us growing up in the church, the only thing you needed to do is show up at church X number of times a week. Sunday worship, Sunday school, prayer meeting, you know, there'd be X number of times a week you show up. And regularity was what everybody was after. But in today's world, I think we're going to see regularity still is important, but there's going to be something far more important, and that's intensity. And that's going to happen through retreats, mission trips, conferences, other kinds of things that take people out of their regular and put them into something challenging and new. I actually don't think that's new either. That whole, this ties into a lot of ancient things as well. So those would be 3 things that I think happen. And that third one is related to digital media, because face-to-face contact doesn't disappear, but it has to become more personal and more intense, I think. So I don't think I will ever start another congregation in my life. I planted a church that I pastored for 24 years, and I helped a number of other churches get started. I don't know if I will ever do it again, but if I did, one of the things I'd strongly think about is building my church not around 52 Sunday services, but building it around 4 weekend retreats. And the primary thing we do as a church would be we'd all organize our schedules to be at those retreats, and then we'd have ways of getting together in between. But I would strongly consider building it on intensity and then adding regularity, and really maximizing then daily contact through digital media. Did you have another question here? It was a long time ago.
I was curious about how you said some of the reformers, Calvin and Luther, they thought outside the box, and I think Matthew Fox is a Catholic,
Yes.
former priest, maybe who.
Now he's Episcopal, but yeah,
Oh, okay.
he was Catholic. You're right.
Okay, and I think he had a book, The New Reformation, or A New Reformation. I wonder some more shape of what you think. Is that what we're seeing, or?
Well, let me give you a couple ways to talk about that. My friend Phyllis Tickle uses the term the Great Emergence, and if you're interested in a book about this, she wrote a very, very good book. She calls it the Great Emergence, that out of our existing traditions, something new is emerging. And the new thing that's emerging is these new things actually have more in common with each other across denominations sometimes than they do with the people in their own denomination. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So she calls it the Great Emergence. I'm working on a book right now that's about Christian identity in a pluralistic world. And I talk about the Great Reformulation, because I think part of what we have the challenge of doing now is not abandoning our historic doctrines, but it's reformulating them. It's seeing them in a new light. It's in some ways debugging the program of some problematic dimensions. So we might think of it as a reformulation. So I think there are a lot of different ways that people are talking about it. I don't think any of us think it's going to be a rerun of the last Reformation, where a group of people say, you're the Antichrist and the whore of Babylon, and we're the pure church. And they say, no, you're not, and none of us are interested in that kind of a name-calling battle again. It's a great question. But I think many of us believe that this will happen making use of existing structures, not throwing out those existing structures, and not limited to those existing structures, but it won't be an anti-structural process. So when people ask me, what do I think the church of the future will look like, I think it will be all of the above. I think we'll see all of our current forms of church, plus I think we'll see some new forms too that could look very different.
What I really wanted to ask you is, where do you see the liturgical churches going? I mean, you talk about being inside a box. There's a fairly rigid formula. How do they find their way into this much more diverse Christianity that's emerging?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for that question. I'm going to tell you my opinion on this. First, let me say, I think there's room for all different kinds of churches as we move forward. Some more liturgical, some less overtly liturgical. I must confess my bias. I think all churches are liturgical. Some, their liturgy is written down, and some it isn't. In the sense that everybody gets in patterns of doing things. But this is my opinion and maybe my own personal bias. But I think that one of the most fertile areas for the future will be liturgical churches experiencing liturgical renewal, because I think liturgy offers an awful lot to people who are new to the faith. Now, I know a lot of people think of liturgy as a barrier, but I think actually we can rediscover liturgy that becomes a great welcome, like an on-ramp into the Christian faith. Let me give you an example. I think a lot of you will know what to say when I say this. The Lord be with you. Okay, so lift up your hearts. Okay, now, I only need to come to church 2 or 3 times before I get that. It's not too complicated. And what you just gave me by giving me a simple way to be involved, especially if I don't need to be looking at a book, if I can just remember that it's simple enough that I can remember, is now I'm part of the drama. There's been an easily accessible way for me to become part of the drama. Also, I think liturgy at its best has been well-chosen, well-thought-out, intentionally formulated words. And if people who are connected digitally to hundreds and maybe thousands of people through Facebook and so on constantly, if they're going to go through all the trouble of getting up and showing up someplace, they want every word to be well-chosen and no words to be wasted. So the era of the sort of rambling person who just goes on and on, it really becomes problematic. But if I come and I know every word that I say has been carefully thought out and has beauty and depth and meaning to it, then I'm going to think, I want to be there because that does something for me. I wrote a book about this, if you're interested. It's called Finding Our Way Again. And it's a place where I try to talk about the importance of liturgy. So I think there's a great future for liturgical churches, but it involves a shift in the mindset from the way a lot of liturgical folks think, which is, yeah, God must have had this like secretary up in heaven who said, yeah, when people get together, here's the checklist, you got to do all these things, prelude, invocation, check, confession of sin, check, Nicene Creed, check, and we got this, and we think of God as this very officious, assembly line guy who just likes people to go through the motions. But if we get that image out of our mind, and instead we get the image of going to a health club, and I don't know if any of you have ever, been out of shape or you want to get in better shape, and you go to the health club, and they assign, very often first they test you and find out how strong you are or weak you are or how bad your heart is or whatever, but they find out what you can handle. And then they say, okay, look, your main need is aerobic exercise, and then your second need is upper body, and your third need is lower body. So how much time do you have? You have 30 minutes 3 times a week? Okay, here's what I'm going to have you do. And a knowledgeable trainer comes up with an agenda for you on Monday, Wednesday, Friday when you come in, and it involves 20 minutes of aerobic and 5 minutes on this, and whatever your sort of prescription becomes. A knowledgeable person gives you a good set of exercises that helps you get stronger over time. Well, if we were to think of the liturgy, it's often defined as the work of the people. I recommend we define it as the work out of the people. And we say, when we get together, what do we want to have happen for people? And we look at every part of the 60 or 90 minutes that we have, and we say, what do people need? How do we have to deepen people spiritually? And we really design that time to have maximum impact. That will help us as we go forward. Can I just say, that's what I want when I go to church. That's what I'm looking for. I got to experience this when I was a pastor. I'll just, a brief anecdote. It's a long story, but an older gentleman and his wife began attending my church. And he was in great distress. They were completely non-religious people. They'd gone to church as children, but when they started smoking cigarettes, they weren't allowed to come to church anymore. And so at least that's what they told me. They hadn't been to church since they were 14 and started smoking cigarettes. And now they were in their 60s. And the husband, one Friday afternoon, when he got home from work, the FBI showed up and confiscated all his computers. And it turned out he'd been involved with child pornography. And he'd been part of a massive sting. Well, imagine, his wife she didn't know this was going on. She was mortified. He was mortified. He was anticipating going to jail. And so they were in agony, and they were so distressed that we were the nearest church to them, and they looked us up. They got our phone number, called us, and started coming to church. And both of them opened their hearts to God and became committed Christians. And they sort of felt like We've only got a limited amount of time till he goes to jail. And so they were there every Sunday. And sitting in the front row because they wanted to soak in every bit of it that they could. And one Sunday it's just so happened when I finished my sermon, I went and sat down, and I was a couple seats away from the man. And that Sunday, we used a confession of sin. And some of you are from traditions where you do this. The confession we normally use, and when you repeat something a lot, you don't even have to try, you memorize it. Almighty God, we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed by what we have done and what we have left undone. We have not loved you with our whole hearts. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. We are truly sorry and humbly repent for the sake of your Son, Jesus. I know that prayer. That's the one we normally used. But this Sunday, our liturgist used a different one, and it came up on the screens so everybody could see it. It always came up on the screen because anyway, but this one was different. I'd never seen us use this one before. And I don't have this one memorized, although we used it several times after that. But it said something like this: Merciful God, our sins are too heavy to bear, too terrible to name. And from them, we need relief and forgiveness. And it went on from there. Well, when we said those words, our sins are too heavy to bear and too terrible to name, nobody in the whole church, except his wife and me, knew what was going on in this guy's life. And all I can tell you is he almost convulsed. It was physically shook. Because for the first time, he had the chance to say in public words that related to how he actually felt in his heart. And I remember that day thinking, this thing of confession of sin, this is real. This is important to admit together, the truth about ourselves. And so many people, it's just something they check off on the list. But for some people, it's a life-saving action. And all of us who are pastors know how many people will say they're sinners, but if you ever tell them they're wrong about anything, they'll chew you out. So they maybe have said a confession, but they've never actually meant it. And part of our challenge in liturgy is to help people actually mean it. And that requires good leadership and more than just that checklist mentality. Another question? People are allowed to ask them on this side too, but that's okay.
Brian, thank you for your presentation. I was interested in the title of your next book, and I wonder if you could speak to the concept of double religious belonging or multiple religious belonging.
Yes.
Certainly coming out of Asia, whether you think that's a bridge too far, or is that part of the creativity that you're seeking to embrace?
Yes, and when you say double religious belonging, you don't mean somebody who's both Baptist and Presbyterian, you mean someone who's Christian and Muslim, is that right? Okay, this is a big question, and for those of you who think that's the craziest question you've ever heard, it's a very, very important question. Okay, I'm writing a book right now. The title is Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad Walk into a Bar. And the subtitle is Christian Identity in a Multi-Faith World. And the big idea of the book is that we know how to have a Christian identity that is strong and hostile toward other religions. And some people don't want to have an identity that's strong and hostile, so we know how to have an identity that is weak and benign toward other religions, weak and inoffensive toward other religions. But there's a problem with both of those alternatives. Obviously, the strong, hostile one creates a world where people hate each other and shoot bombs at each other, and it can lead to horrible, horrible outcomes if strength always goes along with hostility. And if you don't feel that as a Christian, well, you feel it when you hear, a Muslim say hateful things. Well, you don't realize that there are 1,000 things that you say as a Christian that seem hateful to Muslims. Or I think about my neighbor where I used to live. She's Jewish, and one day I was walking out to my car. I was in a hurry to get somewhere, and she always had a way of catching me when I was in a hurry. And she said, "Hey, Brian, I need to talk to you." So I came over, "What's up?" And she said, "I listened to religious radio for an hour this morning." She didn't say religious. "I listened to one of your Christian shows for an hour this morning. And then she said, not for inspiration, but for surveillance purposes. And she said, can you imagine what it feels like for me as a Jewish mother to hear all these preachers say, we're going to take this country back for Jesus? She said, what does that mean for my children? What are these people talking about? What do they want to do if they take the country back? Because it sounds like they might succeed, and I'm worried. Do I need to find another country to live in? So we don't understand how that strength from our own side can really seem like hostility to somebody else. But if we respond by saying, well, you know, it doesn't really matter what you believe. Whatever you believe is okay. It's all, you know, it's all the same. It's whatever you believe as long as you're sincere. In a sense, we become less harmful. We become somewhat harmless. But if that's your approach, then your kids think, why do I need to even bother with this? It doesn't seem to really matter. So we build a kind of faith that doesn't hold attention across generations, if it even can hold anybody's attention. And so the book is basically an argument or a plea for a third alternative, to have an alternative that has a strong identity, but we understand Christian identity so that the stronger you hold it, the more benevolent you are to people of other faiths. So the better Christian you are, the more you love Muslims, whether or not they ever want to convert. The better Christian you are, the more you love Buddhists. The more you not only want to share what you have with them, but you're willing to receive what they want to offer you from their heritage. And that kind of mutuality, I think, Africa. And it was quite a bit smaller then, but it was still quite large. And in eastern Kenya, in a river just south of Mombasa, the wave went up the river where there was a mother and baby hippo floating along, doing whatever hippos do. And it sucked them out into the Indian Ocean when the wave retreated, and the mother drowned. And the next day, some people looked out on a sandbar, and they saw a baby hippo running back and forth on the sandbar, looking agitated and in the hot sun. And so they said, somebody's got to help this animal. So they sent word up to a zoo north of Mombasa and said, hey, you send a truck down here, send some people down here. They came down, and imagine, it wasn't easy. They had to get out to the sandbar, then they had to corral a frightened baby hippo and somehow get it into the truck and get it back to the zoo. When they got it back to the zoo, they had the problem of where they were going to keep it because they didn't have any spare hippo pens lying around. And they looked around the zoo, and they had this old Seychelles Island tortoise who basically sat around looking like a rock all the time. And they thought, we can put the hippo in there because the tortoise never does anything anyway. So they put the hippo in, and they fed the hippo with a bottle. And so they were meeting its physical needs. But what they didn't anticipate is the hippo missed his mama. And when he realized that the tortoise was a living creature, and the tortoise was kind of round like his mother, and it wasn't as soft as his mom, but he starts going up looking for some milk, nuzzling the tortoise, and that just irritated the tortoise no end, and the tortoise would run at full speed away from the hippo, but the hippo was faster, and the tortoise couldn't escape. And the tortoise was looking for kind of snuggling and companionship and more, mammal-like affection. And the tortoise just was as irritated as could be. An old male tortoise, about 100 years old. And even if it was female, reptiles have no maternal instinct at all. So what surprised the zookeepers was not that this hippo bonded with the tortoise. They understood that, looking for a surrogate mother. What surprised them over the weeks to come is that the tortoise began to, at first, tolerate the hippo, and then the tortoise began to seem to prefer the hippo's company, and over a period of weeks, a strange kind of friendship seemed to develop between these two animals that seemed to be somewhat reciprocal. It was as if from that little reptilian brain, a capacity for sociability was evoked by this orphaned hippo, and a beautiful friendship developed out of it. Now you might wonder what that has to do with the church in any way. It doesn't. I just wanted to tell that story. Well, there are many reasons to compare our churches to an old male tortoise. And I won't even say them. And there are many reasons to compare the changes going on in our world to a tsunami, just something that changes our landscape. Our world is changing so rapidly, and it's left a lot of people feeling like that orphan hippo. Orphaned by everything we trusted in, religion as we knew it, science, government, the economy, technology, consumerism, progress. Everything we seem to be able to depend on seems less dependable. And I wonder what could happen if in these times we rediscovered our identity as the church, not just to be our own solitary being withdrawn into the shells of its large buildings, but we actually found through these changes something evoked from us to bring a connection and something that God has given us that the world around us really needs. I wonder if part of what's happening now is that God is bringing us to a place where we have to turn outside of ourselves to join God in God's concern for all of the nuns of this world, all of the people who feel orphaned and alienated. If God turned us back outward to join God in the healing of the world. And at the end of the day, unless that happens, it probably just doesn't matter that much what happens to our churches. If in the process this doesn't happen, we'll have missed the opportunity of the moment. Thank you very much.